Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our podcast. It's good to have you here. Today we're going to continue our discussion of the years 1825 through 1830 by focusing on 2 years, 1828 and 1829. During the fall and early winter of 1828, hostilities surrounding Joseph Smith in Palmyra required a decision to be made. Joseph decided that in this somewhat precarious situation, it might be best to move. And so he and his wife are going to move to Harmony, Pennsylvania, back near Emma's parents. Again, as we discussed in our last podcast, it seems that Isaac Hales had tempered his feelings somewhat relative to Joseph and welcomed their return. Now we're going to introduce you to Martin Harris through primarily this particular presentation. Martin Harris concluded that it was important that he get involved with Joseph Smith in the translation process. He met with him in a tavern in Palmyra and gave him a $50 piece of silver. And he said, and I quote, "I give this to you to do the Lord's work." Well, Joseph insisted that it be considered just a loan. However, Martin reaffirmed his desire to contribute freely to the cause. Meanwhile, Lucy Harris had begun to doubt Joseph's story, possibly because of his insistence to keep the plates hidden from her view. This suspicion led her to resent Martin's increased interest and involvement with Joseph. Now, Martin's relationship with his wife was already strained. His further support of and involvement with Joseph Smith is going to cause a major rift to come between them. A short time after the Smiths arrived in Harmony, Martin paid them a visit and expressed his desire to assist Joseph Smith. He proposed to journey east to New York City with a transcription of some of the characters on the plates and to show them to some scholars back east. Perhaps he wanted additional reassurance that the plates were authentic, or he may have thought perhaps by showing these to people he could secure and borrow money when they needed the money for the Book of Mormon to be printed. Nevertheless, in any event, he insisted and told Joseph that the Lord had prompted him to make this trip. Now, this particular slide shows you a piece of parchment of sorts with some figures on it. This is the so-called anthem transcript or character document. This particular document was actually written between 1829 and 1831 by John Whitmer. He copied this from a document written by Joseph Smith. This is not the text that was examined by Anthon. That copy the actual original copy is lost and does not match the description of what Charles Anthon looked at. So just to make ourselves clear, this is sometimes thought to be the Anthon transcript, and it is in fact not. So this rendering here is what Charles Anthon would look at. This is kind of what the Anthon transcript was supposed to have looked like. In 1980, Mark Hofmann forged and sold to the Church of Jesus Christ his Anthon transcript. The church paid $25,000 for the document. Now, Hofmann's motivation for his forgery centered on greed, of course, and a desire to embarrass and undermine the church. This forgery is, however, what the Anthon transcript looked like that Martin Harris would show. Now, Mark Hofmann, not only a counterfeiter and forger, but a murderer. He was arrested in January of 1986 on 27 different counts. He is currently serving a life sentence at the Point of the Mountain. Hofmann attempted suicide in his cell by taking an overdose of antidepressants. He was revived, but not before spending 12 hours laying on his right arm, blocking circulation, thus causing muscle atrophy. His forging hand was now permanently disabled. I suppose that's appropriate. At the time, neither Joseph nor Martin knew much about the language of the plates. They knew only as much as the angel Moroni had told Joseph that it was an ancient American record. Thus, rather than seeking a scholar with a knowledge of perhaps Egyptian, Martin visited several scholars with an interest in antiquities, especially American antiquities. Joseph, of course, is later going to learn that the plates were written in what is referred to as Reformed Egyptian, perhaps something similar to Coptic Egyptian. Martin departed in February of 1828, and en route to New York City, he stopped in Albany to visit Luther Bradish. Now, Luther Bradish was formerly from Palmyra, and Martin Harris knew him then. He knew that Luther had traveled extensively throughout the Near East and Egypt and thought he'd be a good person to talk to. Martin sought his opinion about whom to visit regarding the translation, and then proceeded on to New York to visit Samuel L. Mitchell. Now, Mr. Mitchell was a linguist and one of the leading scholars on ancient American culture. After examining the characters, Mitchell evidently sent Martin to Charles Anthon, a young professor of grammar and linguist at Columbia College. Anthon had been collecting American Indian stories and speeches for publication, and he was eager to inspect the document that Martin had brought with him. Martin claimed that Anthon declared that the characters were authentic, until he learned how Joseph Smith had acquired them. He suggested that Martin bring the plates to him. Well, Martin refused, and Anthon replied, paraphrasing a verse from Isaiah, quote, "I cannot read a sealed book." Well, though Anthon later denied the details of Martin's account of their meeting, we do know this, that Martin came away from his visits with the Eastern scholars more convinced than ever that Joseph Smith was called of God and that the plates and characters were ancient. He and Joseph viewed the visit to Anthon as a fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy, which, by the way, is also mentioned in the Book of Mormon, which was that a book that is sealed, which men delivered to one that is learned, saying, "Read this, I pray thee." And he saith, "I cannot, it is sealed." Well, just a thought here. Charles Anthon did not, and let me emphasize that, did not have the knowledge to translate Egyptian. By 1828, there was not a dictionary in the United States available to translate Egyptian. The Rosetta Stone was not deciphered until 1822, and the first English translation of Egyptian was not published until 1858. In actuality, the first translation of Egyptian outside of the Book of Mormon was the translation, perhaps, of the Book of Abraham in 1842. It is estimated that Martin Harris traveled about 1,250 miles over a 74-day period just to finally convince himself that the work that Joseph was doing was true. Now, when Martin arrived home after being gone for over 2 months, he found his wife was very angry with him, and that's probably a major understatement. She had planned to go with him to New York, but he had slipped out and left her behind. Martin would miss, while being gone, the marriage of his daughter and also spring planting season. So he felt this trip was very important if he was willing to miss those things. When Martin returned, he found that Lucy had now prepared a separate bedroom for him, which she refused to enter. Although Martin came to believe quite sincerely in Joseph's prophetic call, his wife had turned bitterly hostile. Lucy Harris was concerned, quite understandably, that Martin might take a large financial risk to help publish the book, and that her peers would mock her husband's participation in what they viewed as a fraudulent scheme. She was also stung by the way Joseph rebuked her every attempt to see the plates, and she beleaguered Martin insistently to show her some evidence of Joseph's ability to translate. In March of 1828, Martin left for Harmony, with, of all things, Lucy by her side. Lucy had decreed that she was going with him. Martin agreed that she could go for a couple of weeks, but then he would be taking her back home and return to scribe for Joseph. Mother Smith relates, and I quote, "As soon as she arrived there, she said she had to see the plates and would never leave until she had accomplished it. Without delay, she began ransacking every nook and corner of the house, chests, cupboard, trunks, etc. Consequently, Joseph was compelled to take the plates out of the house and secret them elsewhere. Well, not finding them in the house, she concluded that Joseph had buried them. And the next day she went out and hunted the grounds adjacent to the home. She kept this up until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. When she returned home after 2 weeks in Harmony, she endeavored to dissuade Martin from having anything to do with the translation of the record." On April 12, 1828, Martin returned to Harmony and began to write for Joseph. The process of translation during the Martin Harris time period was done using the Urim and Thummim. As they progressed, Martin asked Joseph, and I quote, "Please inquire of the Lord through the Urim and Thummim if he might carry the writings home and exhibit them to his wife and others." Well, Joseph wanted to please Martin because he had shown him friendship, quote, "when there seemed to be no earthly friend to succor or to sympathize." Well, so Joseph did, of course, inquire for his friend, and the answer Joseph said was that he must not. Martin was not satisfied with this answer and desired that I would inquire again. Well, I did so, and the answer was as before. Still, he could not be contented and insisted that I should inquire one more time. After much solicitation, I again inquired of the Lord, and permission was granted on certain conditions. Martin was to show the translated pages only to his wife, parents, brother, and sister-in-law. We learn now, at this particular point in time, Joseph gave up the Urim and Thummim to the angel. Quote, "For the Urim and Thummim was taken from me in consequence of my having wearied the Lord in asking for the privilege of letting Martin Harris take the writings which he lost by transgression." Well, Martin left on June 14, 1828. The next day, June 15th, Emma gave birth to Joseph's first son. He lived about an hour. Lucy Smith said, quote, "Immediately after Mr. Harris's departure, Emma became a mother of a son. But she had small comfort from the society of the dear little stranger, for he was very soon snatched from her arms and borne aloft to the world of spirits before he had a time to learn good or evil." His name would have been called Alvin, and he was buried in the Smith Cemetery, which today is called the McCune Cemetery, on that very day. Records indicate that Emma was on the verge of death for a couple of weeks, after which she slowly made a recovery. Emma urged Joseph to go find Martin. It had been nearly 3 weeks since they had heard from him. Quote, "After much persuasion, he concluded to leave his wife in the care of her mother for a few days and set out to find Martin." In the meantime, an elated Martin Harris returned home with the manuscript pages and showed them to his wife. He did not, however, handle the precious manuscript with the prescribed care, and it was soon lost. Now, precisely how this happened is pretty much a matter of speculation. One commonly repeated rumor was that Lucy removed the pages from Martin's bureau and then burned them. Though she denied any responsibility for this, some, including Joseph, suspect that perhaps there was a conspiracy where there were wicked men involved. Now, here's a little side note that is of interest. In 1904, Martin Harris Jr., he addressed Rick's Academy in Idaho. And he said his mother on her deathbed said that she had nothing to do with the loss of the 116 pages, that she was a Quaker and would not lie before God on her deathbed. So what really happened to them pretty much remains a mystery to this day. Martin made every effort to find the manuscript, dreading the thought of confessing to Joseph what had happened. He even ripped open his bed and the pillows, but to no avail. When Joseph came to his parents' home after several weeks, eager for news, Martin trudged reluctantly 3 miles to the Smith home in Manchester. As he approached, he walked, quote, with a slow and measured tread towards the house, his eyes fixed thoughtfully upon the ground. When he came to the gate, he did not open it, but got up upon the fence and sat there for some time with his hat drawn over his eyes. He at last entered, and having little appetite for the dinner they had prepared for him, he soon pressed his hands upon his temples and cried out in a tone of deep anguish, "Oh, I have lost my soul." Well, Joseph understood immediately what had happened. He demanded that Martin return and look again for the manuscript, but Martin insisted that further searching was all in vain. Well, exhausted and discouraged, Joseph returned to Harmony, and walking a short distance from his home, he knelt and prayed for mercy. The angel appeared and again gave to Joseph the Urim and Thummim, or interpreters, that Joseph had originally received with the plates, but had lost them for having wearied the Lord and asking that Martin Harris might take the writings. Well, using the Urim and Thummim, Joseph received the earliest of his revelations, for which a text survived. Now known as Doctrine and Covenants, Section 3, the revelation rebuked Joseph, and I quote, "How oft you have transgressed the commandments and laws of God, and have gone on in persuasions of men, for behold, you should not fear men more than God." However, it did held out a little bit of hope. Quoting, "Remember God is merciful, therefore repent of that which ye have done, which is in contrary to the commandments which I gave, and thou art still chosen, and are again called to do the work." Joseph now gave back the Urim and Thummim for the second time to the angel, and also returned the gold plates. It would be nearly 3 months before Joseph would again be permitted to translate the Book of Mormon, not until September 27th, 1828. By October of 1828, Joseph was again translating. However, the process was very slow. Joseph was commanded to go no faster than means were provided to enable him to translate, and I quote, "I did not go immediately to translating, but went to laboring with my hands upon the small farm which I had purchased of my wife's father, in order to provide for my family." Well, during this time, when possible, Emma was his scribe. At this point in translating, Joseph was now using the seer stone. Emma said, and I quote, "I frequently wrote day after day, often sitting at the table close by him, he sitting with his face buried in his hat, with the stone in it, and dictating hour after hour with nothing between us." In November of that year, Joseph and Emma had visitors. Joseph's father and mother came to visit their son. Lucy said, and I quote, "We spent our time very agreeably and returned home relieved of a burden which had seemed too heavy to be borne. The joy we had over the present prosperity of our son with regards to his spiritual concerns far outweighed anything of the kind which we had before experienced. We had now learned to appreciate the sweet, having drunk deeply of the bitter for a season." Well, the translation process continued. However, it only averaged about 3 pages a week. For months, Martin Harris remained at his Palmyra home, haunted over the loss of the manuscript. He was also distressed to discover that his wife and others sought to discredit Joseph Smith and make him out to be a fraud who was simply after Martin's money. Longing for reconciliation and bearing news of these disturbing efforts, he visited Joseph Smith again in Harmony in March of 1829. To Martin's relief, Joseph had obtained forgiveness and was preparing to resume the translation. Martin asked Joseph once more for the privilege of seeing the plates. He desired a firm witness that, quote, "Joseph hath got the things which he hath testified that he hath got." Joseph then received a revelation from Martin, found today in Doctrine and Covenants, Section 5. That would be in March of 1829. In it, the Lord revealed that 3 witnesses would be called to see and give testimony of the plates. And then, to Martin's delight, the Lord promised him that, quote, "if he will go out and bow down before me, and humble himself in mighty prayer, and faith in sincerity of heart, then I'll grant unto him a view of the things which he desireth to view. Well, this revelation also indicated that the book's authenticity would be affirmed by its message rather than by the plates themselves, and that many would not believe even if Joseph were to show them all things. I'm going to read from this slide. By September of 1828, a new face joins our history, Oliver Cowdery. Oliver Cowdery's brother, his name was Lyman, had applied to teach school in the Manchester district and had spoken first to 28-year-old Hiram, who was a trustee of the district. Hiram called a meeting of the other trustees, and they agreed to employ Lyman Cowdery, and they settled on terms. But as Lucy later recalled, and I quote, "The next day Lyman brought his brother Oliver and requested them to receive him in place of himself. Whether because of coincidence or providence, Lyman Cowdery was unable to fill his obligation. Lucy remembered that business had arisen that would oblige him to disappoint them. Whatever this unnamed business was, it set Oliver Cowdery's life on a startling new course. Lyman assured the trustees that Oliver, who had just turned 21, could do the job. Now, presumably, the trustees interviewed Oliver, discovered him that he had acquired a good common school education, and perhaps the trustees were impressed by his serious manner. They likely found him rather articulate for a young man. Whatever the exact details, all parties seemed to be satisfied, and Oliver was given the assignment to teach school. In April of 1829, in answer to prayer, Oliver Cowdery arrived. Oliver was a friend of Joseph Smith Sr. and a teacher in the Palmyra School District. He boarded at the Smith home in Palmyra, where he had heard of the events surrounding Joseph Smith and received a testimony of their truthfulness. He came to Joseph to render assistance, and from his hand nearly all of the translation of the Book of Mormon was penned. Work on the translation recommenced in earnest on April 5, 1829, when Oliver Cowdery assumed the role of scribe. Joseph and Oliver picked up where Joseph and Martin had previously left off. That would be near the beginning of the book of Mosiah. Just a little side note, more than 22% of the revelations found in the Doctrine and Covenants are linked in one way or another to Oliver Cowdery. Other than Joseph himself, no other person is mentioned more often than Oliver. He is found in 36 different sections of the Doctrine and Covenants. Well, as Joseph and Oliver were translating, they became concerned about a subject that they saw referenced numerous times, the subject of baptism. The subject of baptism. For almost 6 years, Joseph had been anticipating the restoration of the priesthood of God. On September 22nd, way back in 1823, Moroni educated Joseph on this subject. He stated, quote, "When the plates are interpreted, the Lord will give the holy priesthood to some, and they shall begin to proclaim his gospel, and baptize by water, and after they shall have the power to give the Holy Ghost by the laying on of hands." So this is an allusion to not only the restoration of the Aaronic priesthood, but the Melchizedek priesthood as well. On May 15, 1829, the Aaronic priesthood was restored. Historical accounts show that Joseph and Oliver had been praying in the woods, quote, "aside from the abodes of men," when John the Baptist appeared to them. Well, the most likely wooded area on Joseph's farm was on the north side of the property where the sugar maples grow. And you can see on the map at the top, you can see where their property is, the circle at the bottom, and that would be north where the sugar maples are. That is Harmony's sacred grove, as far as these good folks are concerned. Well, there was heavy boat traffic on the river at this time, and a lack of tree cover on the other plowed parts of the land. That's where they would end up, would be the maple grove, as they prayed. Any other part of the farm might not have given the men the seclusion they sought, as they asked the Lord about the authority to baptize. Now, Oliver Cowdery describes the answer they received to their prayer. He says, "The voice of the Redeemer spake peace to us, while the veil was parted, and the angel of God came down, clothed with glory, and delivered the anxiously looked-for message." Well, the angel introduced himself as John the Baptist, and conferred on both Joseph and Oliver the Aaronic priesthood, explaining that it holds the keys of the ministering of the angels and of the gospel of repentance and of baptism by immersion for the remission of sins. He then commanded the two of them to go and be baptized. Well, they made their way to the flooded Susquehanna River, choosing a moment when the heavy boat traffic would have been least disturbing. And after baptizing each other, they then ordained each other to the Aaronic priesthood. Now, these ordinations, I suppose they could have taken place on the banks of the Susquehanna, but perhaps also inside their home. Now, 10 days later, the first convert baptism took place. It was none other than Joseph's younger brother, Samuel Smith. Samuel was in Harmony, having escorted Oliver down to Joseph's home. Now, John the Baptist told Joseph that in the very near future the power of the laying on of hands for the gift of the Holy Ghost would be given them. This event happened later that month as Joseph and Oliver were fleeing from their enemies in Colesville en route to Harmony. They were ordained to the apostleship by Peter, James, and John. But the question might be asked, where did this priesthood and event happen? So I want to take a few minutes now and look deep into the restoration of the Melchizedek priesthood with the information and sources that we now have. John the Baptist had explained to Joseph and Oliver that he acted under the direction of Peter, James, and John, who held the keys of the priesthood of Melchizedek, which priesthood, he said, would in due time be conferred on Joseph Smith. Now, many people have wondered when and where this event took place. And since the details we have in the scriptures are not as precise as they are of John the Baptist's appearance, while accounts are limited, I think with careful consideration and the available sources that I'm going to share with you, give quite a bit of insight to those two questions of when and where. Now, in the case of the Aaronic priesthood, we can divide the restoration of the priesthood into several smaller parts that occurred at different places. As I've mentioned in this podcast, in the woods, up in the sugar maples, Joseph and Oliver heard the voice of the Lord and were given the authority by the angel to have the Aaronic priesthood. And then in the river, Joseph and Oliver would baptize each other, and then perhaps in the home they were ordained and set apart in that priesthood. Now, in the case of the Melchizedek priesthood, we know that by the time Doctrine and Covenants section 18 is given in June of 1829, that's a month after they received the Aaronic priesthood, we know that Joseph and Oliver had the Melchizedek priesthood. It's alluded to in that particular section given in June of 1829. We know that in Doctrine and Covenants section 128 that the restoration of the Melchizedek priesthood would take place while Joseph and Oliver are still in Harmony. Well, Joseph and Oliver are going to leave Harmony forever, and for all intents and purposes, on May 28th through the 30th, probably the 29th or the 30th of 1829, and they're going to go to Fayette. So the Melchizedek priesthood was restored sometime between May 15th, when the Aaronic priesthood was restored, and May 30th, when they would leave and head to Fayette to the Whitmer home. So let's explore Doctrine and Covenants 128 a little bit. Joseph Smith recalled that the appearance of Peter, James, and John occurred in the wilderness between Harmony, Susquehanna County, and Colesville, Broome County, on the Susquehanna River. But he did not give a date. How much can we learn from available sources about when and where this happened? We know it happened in a 2-week period of time after the restoration of the Aaronic priesthood. As far as the location is concerned, the wilderness mentioned in Doctrine and Covenants 128:20 likely refers to a stretch of road, old country road, that's 27 miles long, that stretched from Joseph and Emma's home in Harmony and the town of Colesville, New York, where Joseph's early friend and supporter Joseph Knight lived. They were leaving from Joseph Knight's home to return home to Harmony because of evil and wicked men that literally drove them out of town on this particular occasion. The road that they followed comes within sight of the Susquehanna River in 5 different places, none of which were densely populated in 1829. If Joseph followed his pattern of seeking a secluded place to pray, he could easily have found one along the wilderness road. Peter, James, and John restored the Melchizedek priesthood somewhere along the road. Now, I have found a journal entry of a friend of Joseph Smith who said, quote, "The event took place halfway between Colesville and Harmony." That would put it about at mile marker 14. There, halfway down that road, is a beautiful bend in the Susquehanna River near the road that could possibly be the location of the restoration of the Melchizedek priesthood. So backdating to the time after the restoration of the Aaronic priesthood and Joseph's subsequent visit to Colesville, it appears the Melchizedek priesthood was restored approximately 2 weeks after the Aaronic priesthood was restored, on or about the 30th of May, 1829, just prior to Joseph and Oliver leaving Harmony and heading to Fayette. Now I want to turn our attention to the process or the processes of how the Book of Mormon was translated and what we can learn from the available sources we have today. The process of translation, I think, can be visualized as we compare what is left of the original Book of Mormon manuscript to the printer's copy and subsequent copies of the book, meaning 1830 copies, original copies. Just note that the original manuscript was placed by Joseph Smith in the cornerstone of the Nauvoo house in 1842. Unfortunately, because of water damage, the original manuscript was nearly destroyed. Only 28% of the original manuscript remains today. Now, I want you to look at this slide with me for just a second. On the right-hand side, we have a photograph of a piece of the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon. Evidence from the way the original manuscript was written indicates that it was indeed transcribed from the dictation of a spoken voice. So we're comparing the original manuscript to the printer's manuscript, or the printer's copy, which, by the way, we purchased in 2017 from the Community of Christ Church, the RLDS Faith, for $35 million. So we're comparing these 2 copies and a few other 1830 copies of the Book of Mormon to try and get a better feel for the translation process. Emma said, "I once felt the plates as they lay on the table, tracing their outline and shape. They seemed to be pliable like thick paper and would rustle with a metallic sound when the edges were moved by the thumb." Joseph Smith III said, as the plates were translated in Emma's house, she saw that Joseph was reading from no other book or manuscript other than the metallic plates. The Book of Mormon was orally dictated. Any errors in the original manuscript are from scribes that are mishearing words or misspelling words. When the scribe had written the text, he or she would evidently read it back to Joseph for corrections. David Whitmer said the translation process occurred in full view of Joseph Smith's family and associates. The common image of a curtain hanging between the prophet and his scribes is kind of a misunderstanding. There was indeed a curtain in the last part of the stages of the translation at the Whitmer home in Fayette, but that was put in front of the door near the window to prevent passerbyers and gawkers from coming in and staring into the home. Martin Harris said the prophet used a seer stone for convenience, as well as the Urim and Thummim to translate with. The seer stone was put in a hat in order to obscure the surrounding light. The sentence would appear and be written by Martin. He would then repeat the sentence to Joseph, and if correct, the sentence would disappear, and another appear in its place. If the sentence was not correct, the sentence would remain and be visible until corrected. On one occasion, Martin found a stone very, very similar to Joseph's seer stone. He put this stone in Joseph's hat and replaced it. Joseph remained silent when looking at the stone. Suddenly he said, "Martin, what is the matter? All is dark in Egypt." Martin then confessed what he had done, and when asked by Joseph why he did such a thing, Martin said, and I quote, "To stop the mouths of fools who had told him that Joseph had learned the sentences the night before and was merely repeating them." Access was given our church by the Community of Christ Church to the original printer's copy of the Book of Mormon manuscript, which we now own. This manuscript was held by the Whitmer family until 1888, when it was eventually sold to the RLDS Faith, or the Community of Christ Church today. This document was compared and analyzed with the 28% of the original manuscript owned by the church, as well as additional pieces of original manuscript that are owned by the Wilford Woodruff Museum in Bountiful. It was then compared to the various early printings of the Book of Mormon, including 22 different copies of the 1830 Book of Mormon owned by the Community of Christ Church. This is kind of an interesting side note as you look closely at the two boxes that I have on this slide. The 1842 printing of the Book of Mormon is the most rare. Not necessarily the most valuable, but the most rare. This edition has dropped the junior from Joseph Smith's name because his father had died by this time. There were only 640 copies made, and few have survived to this date. So let us take a look at some of the important things, some of the important findings that we have discovered in this comparative research. Scribal corrections in the original manuscript support statements made by eyewitnesses of the translation that Joseph sometimes had to spell out unfamiliar words found in the Book of Mormon. For instance, when the name Coriantumr was first appeared in the Book of Mormon, Oliver Cowdery first spelled it out phonetically with a couple of M's and R's. Then he immediately crossed out the whole name and spelled it correctly. Joseph evidently spelled it out letter by letter for him. In fact, Oliver ended the final R with a huge stroke of his quill as if he were saying, "How on earth would you expect me to spell that?" Another evidence of the spiritual nature of the translation, and I find this just so fascinating, is called Hebraistic literism. These phrases are completely uncharacteristic in English. So you don't find them anywhere in the English language, but you find them in Hebrew. An example is the extra "and" found after the "if" clause in Moroni 10:4. "If ye ask with a sincere heart, with real intent, having faith in Christ, and he will manifest the truth of it unto you." You see, today's text, that "and" has been removed, so it flows more clearly to us. But in the Hebraistic text over on the right-hand side, the "and" is there. "And he will manifest the truth of it unto you." This is incredible stuff. It really, really is. Joseph Smith acted as his own scribe for 28 words of the original manuscript. These 28 words are the earliest known handwritings of Joseph. Here Joseph seems to have taken over for a moment for Oliver. Perhaps he needed to go use the restroom or go get a drink. This number of copied words by Joseph seems to be what Joseph could see at any one given period of time. Alma 45:22 in Joseph's own handwriting, "Yea, in every city throughout all the land which was possessed by the people of Nephi, and it came to pass they did appoint priests and teachers." That's in Joseph's handwriting. Now, I have inserted in this slide a signature piece that my wife and I own, just so you can see Joseph's signature there. Joseph Smith's signature. So in his own handwriting, that particular verse in Alma 45 was written. Now this is fascinating. Along with the loss of the first 116 pages of the original manuscript, which was called the Book of Lehi, most of the original first 2 chapters of the Book of Mosiah were also apparently lost. In the printer's manuscript, the one that would be sent to the printer to become our Book of Mormon, Mosiah was originally designated, the first chapter in Mosiah was designated as chapter 3. Chapter 3. So we're missing the first 2 chapters of Mosiah. They were part of the 116 pages lost. And this explains why the book we start Mosiah chapter 1 in the middle of a sentence, Mosiah 1:1, and now there was no more contentions in the land of Zarahemla. So we lost a couple of chapters of the book of Mosiah. Chapter headings and book divisions came as quite a surprise to Joseph. He could not see in advance as to where the text was concluding. He would periodically come to a break of sorts in the dialogue, and in that case he would tell the scribe to write chapter. But chapter numbers and book divisions would come later. Now, these are just a few of the findings that point to the reality that the Book of Mormon was translated by the gift and power of God. Now, in May, as Joseph and Oliver approached the end of the Book of Mormon, as we now have it, they wondered about whether they should translate the lost portion of the Book of Mormon. To address this question, the Lord gave Joseph Smith another revelation, now found as Doctrine and Covenants, section 10. Therefore you shall translate the engravings which are on the plates of Nephi, down till you come to the reign of King Benjamin, or until you come to that which you have translated, which you have retained. And behold, you shall publish it as the record of Nephi, and thus I will confound those who have altered my words. The revelation confirmed Joseph's fears of a conspiracy. Quote, behold, Satan hath put into their hearts to alter the words which you have caused to be written. However, the Lord reassured Joseph that he had long prepared a solution. Joseph was commanded not to retranslate the lost portion, but to supplant it with the translation of the plates of Nephi. Now, these are the small plates of Nephi. The lost 116 pages were taken from the large plates. So we're translating now from the small plates of Nephi, which covered a similar period of time. Thus the Lord would frustrate, of course, the plans of wicked men. The opportunity to translate the small plates of Nephi, which seems to be, to me, a second set of plates, is going to take place in Fayette, New York, at the home of David Whitmer. So we're going to conclude our translation of the Book of Mormon by translating the plates of Nephi in Fayette. It is evident that the lost 116-page incident weighed heavy on Joseph's mind. In an original, if you got a hold of an original 1830 copy of the Book of Mormon, we find what is referred to as a preface page. It is positioned, of all things, prior to the witness testimonies and a following explanation of the book's pages. To Joseph, this preface page was very important. He wanted the world to know the evil designs of men could not thwart the will of God. The preface page describes the entire incident of the lost 116 pages. This is not in our Book of Mormon today. It is in the original 1830. All right, it is time to leave Harmony forever. We're headed to Fayette. Emma's never again going to see her parents. The persecution was now pretty severe down there, and the final translation would be accomplished in Fayette, New York. We've talked today about Martin Harris and that God is a merciful God. We've talked about Oliver Cowdery, a man with great faith and courage. We discussed the baptism of both water and fire, and we've taken an in-depth look at the translation process of the Book of Mormon. Our next podcast that we're going to have is going to be an Easter podcast. We're here in April, and we're going to have a special Easter podcast. And the following podcast will conclude our last 2 years, 1829 and 1830, of our discussion of the 5-year block of time from 1825 to 1830. In closing, I want to recommend a church video that you might want to watch. It's called The Days of Harmony. It's an excellent video. I've seen it many, many times. We show it quite often when we're down in Harmony with groups of people. And it covers some of the same period of time that we've been discussing today. So I want to thank you again for joining us for our podcast, and I look forward to a special Easter message next time we meet. Thanks again.